Hi, and welcome everyone to Ethereal Encounters Unveiled. Today we are broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, 105.3 on the Gulf Coast and 107.7 FM in beautiful New Orleans. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And you just heard in our intro that we are live, and we mostly are, but today you're watching a pre-recording of this, and we love offering them to our guests because lots of times they just can't make the live event. So we want to make sure we can accommodate everyone, but don't let that stop you from hopping in the chat and leaving any questions or comments you may have. I will make sure that our guest does get them. So we're going to be talking about a topic that I'm super excited about. And again, welcome to Ethereal Encounters Unveiled. And you're listening to us on all social media platforms, including United Public Radio Network and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, which is 105.3 on the Gulf Coast and 107.7 FM in New Orleans. We have a lot of radio listeners, and we thank you for that. So I want you to think back to the very first video games that you've ever played. Simple pixels, basic rules, and a clear divide between the real world and the screen world, right? Well, just in a few short decades, we've moved from Pong to a hyper-realistic virtual reality that can fool our senses. But what if that trajectory doesn't end with us building a simulation, but with the realization that we're already inside of one? This is one of the most exciting topics I think we can talk about today. And excuse my raspy voice, I have a little bit of laryngitis I'm getting over. Today we're joined by Rizwan Virk. He is a Silicon Valley veteran, a computer scientist, and a venture capitalist who bridges the gap between the cutting edge technology and the ancient mysteries. He's also a graduate of MIT and Stanford University. Rizwan Virk is a successful entrepreneur, video game pioneer, film producer, as I mentioned, a venture capitalist and a professor. And he's also the best-selling author of The Simulation Hypothesis, which I read and will blow your mind. I actually highlighted so much in there to get back to. Virk's video games include Tapfish, Penny Dreadful, and so many more that have been played by millions. He was the founder of Play Labs at MIT, which is a video game accelerator at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and currently he teaches at Arizona State University. And in his book, The Simulation Hypothesis, he argues that the pixels of our universe are already visible if we know where to look, and that our reality may be the most sophisticated piece of software ever written. And we're going to take a deep dive into the science, the math, and the mind-bending possibility that we aren't just observers, that we're the players within it. So let me welcome Rizwan. Oh, there we go. So nice to have you today.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on your show. Glad to be here.
Oh, thank you. I loved your book. It was absolutely phenomenal. This is one of the most intriguing topics I've ever discussed because we hear so much about it. Elon Musk has talked about it, and so many other entrepreneurs and inventors, developers, they all talk about these things. And it kind of sounds like sci-fi, right? And after I read your book, I just think even more that we are in some type of video game multiverse. It's crazy. So I'm going to step away for a minute, and I gave you a pretty nice intro, but I want you to talk about, let's get your banner running here so folks can reach out to you on your website and get your book there. And I want you to talk about what the inspiration was for this book and what drove you to like rewrite it. You have a second edition out, correct?
Yes, that's right. Just came out with a second edition this last July. And so, my background is as a computer scientist, and then I became an entrepreneur in the video game industry, and we had the number one game in the App Store. We sold it that to a bigger Japanese company, and then I became an advisor and mentor to an investor in a bunch of different startups. And it was during visiting one of those startups that I was trying on a virtual reality headset. And this was back in 2016. So this is almost, I guess it is 10 years ago now that it's 2026.
Yeah.
And back then, they were really bulky headsets. They weren't even wireless. There were wires coming down from the ceiling. And so I put on this headset and started playing a virtual reality ping pong game. And the graphics weren't that great either. But what happened was that the physics engine was so good, the responsiveness was so good, that it started to fool my brain into thinking that I was playing a real game of table tennis. Like if I held my arm at just the right spot with just the right force, it would actually impact the ball for my opponent. And so for a moment, it fooled my body. And at the end of the game, I basically decided to put the paddle down on the table and lean against the table. Of course, there was no table. It was just me in a big room with a bunch of wires from the ceiling. And so the controller fell to the floor. I almost fell over. And so this was one of several virtual reality experiences that year that really got me thinking, well, how long would it take us to build something that would fool you, not just for a moment, which is what happened here, but really to fool you for a much longer period of time, a virtual reality that was indistinguishable from physical reality, so that you would forget about the outside, quote unquote, outside world. And so that got me down this rabbit hole of what I call the simulation point, which is a kind of singularity, a technological singularity. When most people hear that term, they think of AI and super intelligence and the Terminator and Skynet taking over the world. But the term was originally coined in this context by a guy named Werner Vinge, who was a computer science professor and a science fiction writer, of all things. And he basically said it was any point at which technology will make human existence completely different, and the technology will grow exponentially. And so AI is one way that we get there. But another way I think we get there is to have these ultra realistic simulations that you can totally immerse yourself into. So that was my original motivation. So I wrote the first edition of the book back in 2019, which was released on March 31st that year, which was the 20th anniversary of the film The Matrix. And of course, the idea that we're in a virtual reality, that is the most popular media representation.
Yeah.
So that book went on to be a bit of a bestseller. And then what happened in the last 6 years is that AI happened, right? So back in 2019, I was writing about what might happen with AI. But in the intervening years, with the release of ChatGPT and then Grok and Claude and autonomous agents, AI has gotten so good that my publisher, Penguin Random House, felt like it was time to do a second edition. And also virtual reality had gotten much better. And the term the metaverse had gotten popular for a while anyway. And so that's why I ended up writing the second edition. But I think if you step back for a second, moving back from my technical background, I used to always live what I called a double life. Like during the day, I'd be running a startup and working with venture capitalists and finance people and engineers. But in the evenings and the weekends, I would be exploring different aspects of consciousness. And I'd be flying to places like the Monroe Institute. And
wonderful.
Shamanic dream work with a guy named Robert Moss and energy healing. So I had this kind of double personality. And when I started to think about what it would mean to build an ultra realistic simulation, that's when I started to draw the link between this techno-scientific idea. Like when Elon Musk talks about it, when Nick Bostrom, who's a philosopher at Oxford, talks about it, they're mostly talking about AI. But there's another version of the simulation hypothesis that ties to the spiritual traditions, that it becomes a way to explain many of these things that are unexplainable. So that's the broader context of why I wrote this book, was to try to bring these worlds. And now I'm in academia and I teach, just got a PhD after many years. And I spend time in Silicon Valley, and I spend time with people who are in the UFO community or who are doing, consciousness exploration. And so, I wanted a way to bring all of these different circles together. And it turns out simulation theory has a vocabulary and a language and a metaphor and a way of thinking about it through video games, which is my background, that can really tie all of these things together. I mean, you can't go to a physicist at MIT and say, okay, let's talk about past lives, but you can say, hey, what if we were in a simulation and you ran the simulation more than once? Well, then you can at least have a conversation about it. They may not believe you, but you can still have those conversations. Yeah. Whereas before they would just kind of ignore you.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how your book is looked upon in the world of academia. Like, what's the take on that? Do they discuss it with you? Are there any prominent folks in your area that say, hey, you're onto something here?
Well, yeah, I mean, there have been people who have said that to me in academia. I mean, there have been a lot of people in different circles, not just in academia, who have reached out to me, whether it's spiritual circles or you mentioned Elon Musk in the introduction, has talked about the simulation theory quite a bit. But there are an increasing number of academics who are looking at this idea more seriously now, because they're starting to realize that the world is a kind of computation. And if that's the case, then we could be inside a simulation. Interesting enough, people on the religious side have also started reaching out to me. And that was interesting to me, because I was worried that I would get, some pushback from the more, kind of fundamentalist parts of different religions. And it turns out the religious community has been very open to this because it becomes a new way to reinterpret the ancient texts, but in a way that you can say, well, there's maybe some scientific or technological basis for all these things that they've been saying all along.
Wow. I have to ask you, has any studies been done on the physiology of, after you're using these VR headsets, and you mentioned you were playing ping pong or something, does the body respond as if you were playing as well? Like, have they done muscle tests and stuff?
There have been studies, and I think this is an area that will require more study, because what's happened with virtual reality and virtual worlds, and what we call the metaverse, is there have been these waves of popularity. Like around 2007, 2008, there was a platform called Second Life, where you had an avatar that was representing you and you'd wander around. And people did a lot of studies, and that was without the headset. That was just, and they found that, when another person's avatar is smiling at you, right, and it's an attractive avatar, it actually changes your physical reactions. And there's something called the Proteus effect, which is if your avatar is doing certain types of things, it gives you more confidence as well, if people in the virtual world are treating you a certain way. So there has been, academic research done on that. And then later, if you go to the next wave of popularity of VR, it was around 2016, 2017, which is when I was playing the ping pong game. And at that time, they started to look at ways to use VR for phobias. So, for example, having a spider coming up to you in VR, or being, being up in a very high place. If you have
like immersion therapy, I think it's immersion therapy.
Yeah, and then there are all kinds of relationships that have started within virtual worlds. There was a movie that came out, We Met in VR, for example, a few years ago, and so. Now, obviously, it's not exactly the same, because it's not 100% immersive. But if you look at it from the point of view of, one, you're interacting with people online, how does that make you feel? Well, it turns out you're interacting virtually anyway. Anytime we're on social media, we send a message to someone and they send it back. Well, that's a virtual interaction. You and I are actually talking virtually right now, right? I'm not really talking to you. Right. I'm talking to my computer, and you're talking to your computer. And so you can actually have real world effects based upon what happens virtually. And the more immersive it is, the more likely it is that it will have those physiological changes. But I think that's an area where we definitely need to do more research as well.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I've seen and interviewed so many people that have done spiritual healings, through Zoom and live chat. So, and they're real, and they really do affect folks. So it's interesting to me, because I remember when the glasses first came out, the AI glasses, the virtual reality, and they didn't really take off as big as I thought they were going to be. And then people that were in the metaverse, especially on Zuckerberg's platform, they were
Yes.
complaining about the way they were being treated in there, especially women, that women were being sexually assaulted and not treated very nicely in there. And then all of a sudden it just like died off and nobody really talks about it much. What accounts for that?
Which part? The dying off or
Yeah, the dying off, just
well,
people not.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, just people not. Um, it's not as big as I thought it would turn out to be. And then we could talk about why people are treated so poorly from what I've read and heard.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think Silicon Valley tends to go through waves. And we're in the middle of one of the biggest waves right now, which is the AI wave. And, when I did my first startup, it was during the .com wave where, many entrepreneurs rushed in and they built exciting new products and websites. And we're seeing that with AI now. And then the other big wave that I participated in was the mobile wave when the mobile phone first came out. The top apps were gaming apps. And just before that, the mobile app, people were playing games on Facebook. And so there was a wave of social gaming. And then that went down as mobile became more popular. So with VR in general and the metaverse in particular, I think that it's gone through these waves. And I call the wave that just ended with Zuckerberg renaming his company as Meta. There was a lot of hype. The metaverse was on the cover of Time magazine as the Metaverse 2.0 wave. And then there's going to be a Metaverse 3.0 wave. And I think what's really inhibiting it is the adoption of the physical headsets. They're still very bulky. They're still heavy. They're not that easy to use. I mean, even I, who study this stuff, don't like to spend too much time within these headsets. Now, if you get a form factor like my glasses here, or your glasses, right? And there are groups that are working on that. Well, now you have the ability to try to integrate the virtual and the physical worlds with something called augmented reality. So I think these are just natural waves. And there tends to be, a lot of optimism for any new technology. And in general, in Silicon Valley or even the media, they're not always that good at predicting, how a technology is actually going to be adopted by consumers. But you can see the number of startups. And so when people create applications that are killer applications, that's what tends to drive the adoption of the platform itself. So if you look back at PCs, I mean, nobody thought that personal computers, were really going to take off. Nobody in the legacy computer industry. It actually took a program called VisiCalc and then later 123 that really drove the adoption of the Apple II and the IBM PC. So and then games started to appear because then people were like, okay, I bought it for the spreadsheet. Now what am I going to do with it the other 29 days of the month that I don't need to be working on my spreadsheet to do my financial stuff? And so games started to become one of the most popular platforms, most popular applications. And like I said earlier, when the iPhone came out, Steve Jobs, I mean, they didn't anticipate that this would become the biggest part of the video game industry, which is actually one of the largest industries in the world. It's actually bigger than the Hollywood box office and the music record industry combined today. And the biggest segment of that is just mobile game, just on your phone, not even accounting for all the consoles and everything else. So, I think these things tend to be decided by consumers. But I think with VR, it's pretty obvious that it's just a hard form factor yet. If you've watched the film Ready Player One, did you ever see that movie?
Yeah, I sure did.
And so that was one of the sci-fi representations of the metaverse. And in that, it was a really thin, almost like an eye mask, like the eye mask you might wear in a plane. That's the form factor that might actually work. Now, the term metaverse actually comes from a science fiction book called Snow Crash, a cyberpunk book from Neil Stephenson from 1992, which still hasn't been made into a movie. So most people outside of kind of the geek world don't know
Right.
that. But it turns out it had both VR and AR elements, because you could actually be out in the real world and you could be looking into the metaverse as well at that point.
Wow, that's so trippy. I'll tell you, I got a pair of these Ray-Ban meta glasses, AI sunglasses, and I love them. And they're not virtual reality, but
But how do you use them? Yeah.
I
What do you
love
use them
them.
for? Yeah.
I use them for sunglasses. They're polarized and whatnot. But let me tell you, that thing will make phone calls for you, answer your text messages from any platform, play music flawlessly. It's connected to AI, so it answers any. I mean, it's like a little computer. It takes video, pictures. I mean, I love it. It scares me a little bit, but I love tech, so I dove right into that. But I see maybe something this size would become more virtual, and but then you've got Elon with his chips, and I just read that he's going to mass produce them. I don't know who in the world would implant them into their brain, but I'm sure a large population might. I mean,
yeah, well, I think on the glasses, you can see this wave of technology in that there was something called Google Glass back in 2013.
Yeah, I remember that.
And it didn't take off, right? And people got upset with because they might have been recording. So there's privacy concerns. But you can see how that kind of died. And then it's come back around with the addition of AI to this form factor. And I think that is kind of how technology works. And today, there's a lot of alternative form factors, right? So far, the dominant form factor for most of our interaction, it went from the PC to the laptop to the mobile smartphone. And now there are companies, and that's why Meta invested so much in these platforms, is they're trying to figure out, okay, what's the next platform? So there are companies called B, and there's another one. B was bought by Amazon, that is just like a little wristband. And it basically listens to your meetings and summarizes them for you using AI. So it's a different way to get to the AI functionality, which could end up being, the killer app would be to have your own AI assistant with you all the time. Now that raises privacy concerns, because if you're sitting there and you're actually having a conversation with someone, on the one hand, it's extremely useful. If anyone's ever been in meetings all day long, and you don't remember exactly what the action item was from meeting number 3 or summarizing it. So it turns out it's actually quite extremely useful just as a summarization tool. But if you're sitting with someone and they don't know they're being recorded, and it has to send your information up to the server, which raises other privacy concerns. We've already, we know a lot, there's facial recognition concerns as well. So you have the pluses and the minuses of technology all coming to play. But when you talk about this form factor for VR, and then you talk about the BCIs. So about a third of my book, The Simulation Hypothesis, is what I call the 10 stages of technology to get to the simulation point. And so the simulation point, I gave it a formal definition because I taught the first class, ever college class, at least that I know of, in the US, on the idea that we're in a simulation. It's called simulation theory, science fiction, technology, philosophy, and religion. So it's basically it touches almost every endeavor of a human, activity. But those stages. So I came up with a formal definition, which is when we can create a virtual environment that is indistinguishable from physical reality with AI characters or NPCs, non-player characters, that are indistinguishable from characters that are either human or being controlled by a human. Then you get to that point, and we're rapidly approaching that. And BCIs are like stages 7 and 8 on that on that road, because if you look at the Matrix, what was their form factor? It wasn't a virtual reality helmet. It was actually something that plugged into the back of your head, and that's what you might eventually need in order for it to be truly indistinguishable from physical reality. Now, there's a sequel to Ready Player One, the book. There was the movie that came out, with Steven Spielberg, 2018. But Ernest Cline, the guy who wrote it, actually came out with a sequel called Ready Player 2. And that was the next version of the VR headset. Was they called it a neural interface. And so I think those are coming. But there's two types of BCIs. And there's invasive BCIs, where you have to put a chip in the brain or you have to do something physical. And then there's non-invasive BCIs. And Elon is talking about the invasive BCIs. Yeah, I think a lot of us would be skeptical of that. I mean, the initial user group really is, people who might have physical injuries in the spinal cord and aren't able to move their limbs. And so I think for that purpose, an invasive BCI makes sense because it's
or if you're blind, if you have disability, yeah.
But to get the EEG data, you don't actually need an invasive. It works a little faster. They use a slightly different signal. They can connect faster, but there are non-invasive ones as well. And again, it gets back to the form factor. Like, are you going to have this big thing on your head that's very bulky, even though it's not invasive? Or eventually, will that be incorporated into these same glasses that we're talking about? That's an interesting question. If you ever watch Black Mirror, they have a number of good episodes.
They sure do. We just had a discussion about the grief bots, because that was a Black Mirror episode, and then somebody took the idea and actually created them. So it's crazy.
Yeah, there's a lot of these grief bots out there, and they raise all kinds of interesting questions about ethical questions and how do you move on if you can still talk to your loved ones with AI. But there's another episode called San Junipero. I don't know if you've ever seen that episode.
What was that about?
It starts off in this kind of Mexican beach town in the 80s, and they're at a dance club. And there's these two sort of youngish women who meet, and it's about their adventures. But then you realize, because they come back the next week and the next week, and then suddenly they're in different decades. They're in the same place, this town of San Junipero, this beach town. But it turns out they are actually both, in nursing homes, and they're much older. They're kind of at the end of life stage, and they have these little pods you put right here on your temples, on either side of your eyes, and that's the whole interface. And then they have their avatar, which is like their 30-year-old selves, or 20-something, or 30, whatever you want. Which is interesting because to me, having studied a lot of near-death experiences. And people who are kind of at that phase of transitioning, they'll talk about how they'll see their loved ones who have passed, but they'll see them in that same age of 30 years old, or whatever whatever age they were most comfortable in, or 40 years old, etc. But that was what was going on there, and it turns out it was a virtual world that they were in. And there's a lot of other great Black Mirror episodes that talk about this and talk about BCIs as a way to get into there. And so we're getting closer and closer to the simulation point, but we're still a few years away, at least.
Oh God, yeah. There was a good movie Tom Cruise was in where he was deformed, I think, from a car accident, and they gave him a choice to live a virtual life. And then he was to be to have amnesia and not know it. I forget the name of it. But it was
Vanilla Sky.
Yes, it was Vanilla Sky.
I only saw that once back in the 90s, which is odd because I watched just about every other simulation themed film out there, and I'll often use it in my classes.
It was so good.
Yeah, they're really interesting. There's a new one on Netflix now called The Great Flood, which is a Korean one. Which is worth watching for people. I won't give it away. We can spoil the 30-year-old movies. I tell my students my best representation of simulation theory is not just The Matrix. There was a film that came out in the same year in 1999. And it kind of got swallowed up by the hype of The Matrix, so not many people saw it. It's called The 13th Floor.
Oh, and I think I saw that.
You may have seen it. If you remember, the guy drives to the edge of Los Angeles. What happens is it takes place in 1999 in Los Angeles, and they have created a virtual world of 1937 LA. So they go back into there, and that is what's called an ancestor simulation in simulation theory terms. So we have there's all these new there's all this new vocabulary that we talk about now using simulation theory, and within that there are these characters in 1937 who think they're real, and they're AI characters. So in a sense, they're kind of like NPCs. But what I like about the 13th floor is it hints at what I think is one of the more important aspects of the simulation hypothesis, which people like Elon Musk or Nick Bostrom or Neil deGrasse Tyson, any of like the science and technology guys, when they talk about simulation theory, they kind of neglect to mention this. But I call it the NPC versus the RPG versions of simulation theory. So NPC stands for non-player character. They're the people inside a game that are not controlled by humans. They're just AI characters. So, if you're the term originally comes out of Dungeons and Dragons. You had people sitting around. If anyone's a fan of Stranger Things, it's kind of led a resurgence of Dungeons and Dragons. But the dungeon master would basically play those characters like the bartender, or the guy that's selling you, the weapons or the enemies. And now in video games, NPCs are used as the characters that are just in the game. And so there's a version of simulation theory that says everybody is just AI running in this simulation. But then there's this other version that I call the RPG version. And that stands for role-playing game version. And in that, we are players outside of the game, and we have a character. It's called an avatar inside the game. And that's the character we control. And if you think about it, in the Matrix, that version was the RPG version, because Neo and Trinity and Morpheus all existed outside of the virtual world. And then they had a character that was exactly, looked, more or less the same. They had an avatar. And the term avatar, of course, comes from Sanskrit. And it's a term that means when a divine entity squeezes itself into a small human body, small from the perspective of the divine entity.
The universe,
Yeah. And it turns out when the guys at Lucasfilm, which was, after George Lucas made Star Wars, he started his company Lucasfilm, and they had a video game division, and they had created one of the first MMORPGs. It wasn't really MMORPGs. It wasn't a massively multiplayer game. It was just a multiplayer game because you couldn't have that many people. It was on the Commodore 64, and you had dial-up lines to bulletin board with that old modem sound. But they were looking for a term to call the little character on the screen that they were each person was controlling their own character. And they said it felt like they were squeezing themselves from their human body into the phone line, into this tiny little 2D character on the Commodore 64 screen. So they ended up using this term from Sanskrit, avatar, which has spiritual ties, which they weren't really concerned about the spiritual side of it. But,
it's brilliant if you think about it. It's like the perfect, name. So it's almost like our souls are the observer, and where the avatar where the body that this avatar squeezed itself into. And that's, I guess, the game, right? We're in the game, but
And that's why, when I talk about simulation hypothesis, I talk about it as a video game, because that is the best metaphor to date. So the soul is the player of the game, and then our body is the avatar or the character that's being controlled by the player, which is the soul outside. But our character is learning things here in this real world, and the things that happen in the game are actually real to the character. And so, this is why I started to go deep into the spiritual side. As I looked at each of the different religions, I found that they were all saying something similar to this, was that we have an existence outside of the physical world, that the physical world is not the real world. And they would use metaphors to try to describe this concept. If you go back, to the Vedas, they talk about the world being a dream, or Maya, or they talk about the world being a play, the play of the gods, the Leela. And Shakespeare talked about it being like a stage play, like all the men and women are players. All the world's a stage, and the men and women are merely players. Well, it turns out yesterday, or day before yesterday, I guess, from when this airs, was the birthday of Swami Yogananda. and who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi. And he came over in 1920 from India, and he was one of the first Indian swamis to bring some of these ancient mystical yogic ideas to the West. But at that time, you're looking at a predominantly Christian nation that wasn't, you didn't really have the New Age movement. You had some of the spiritualist movements from before. And so he had to use terminology and metaphors to try to explain these spiritual ideas to the people of the time. And he came up with a new one for this idea that the world is an illusion. And it was based on the technology of the time. And he said the world is like a film projector. And the actors are in the movie and they're going through their scenes. And of course, the characters suffer, but the actors don't actually die when the character dies.
Right.
And the whole thing is a light being projected. And he would tell his students, try to look away from the screen because we get so immersed in the drama of the screen. And so that was a metaphor that used the latest technology. And today, I think if Yogananda were alive today, I actually wrote a book about him called Wisdom of a Yogi. It was funny because HarperCollins India contacted me right after I wrote the first edition of this book. And they said, we'd like you to write a book about lessons in Autobiography of a Yogi, which was the book that introduced a lot of Westerners, particularly in the 60s and 70s, to meditation and yoga.
Sure.
Steve Jobs' favorite book. It was, the only book on his iPad when he died. George Harrison of the Beatles would give it away. And it's not as well known with today's younger generation. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
So I got a call from HarperCollins India saying, we want to write a book about lessons that Yogananda was trying to teach through his life story, through his autobiography for the 75th anniversary. And I said, okay. And they said, we want you to write this book. And I was like, oh, really? You sure you want me to write this book? I write about simulation hypothesis. I write about business and spirituality, but, I'm not a Swami. And they said, no, we want you to write it because we wanted to appeal to a younger generation in India and use technology metaphors as a way to explain these ancient spiritual
brilliant.
And so that's when I ended up going deep on that idea and the idea of karma as an algorithm that's actually storing quests for us in a database. Those quests are things that we might have to come back to. And we decide, I'm going to take this quest with this person. And that quest could be like a relationship quest, like in a video game, a multiplayer quest. It could be an antagonistic quest. It could be an achievement. You're trying to, go to the goblin castle and kill the goblin king. But in real life, it might be, I'm going to start a podcast or I'm going to become a writer. You have these kind of predefined storylines, but you still have to choose your character before you start the video game. Just like in Dungeons and Dragons, you have to say, okay, I'm going to be an elf.
Right.
I'm going to be a dwarf or a human, and then you have to choose your profession. I'm going to be a thief. I'm going to be a wizard. I'm going to be a paladin or a fighter or whatever, And there's limited classes within Dungeons and Dragons, but in the real life, we have a lot more options in the game of life. But I believe we all do something similar. We sort of choose. We have a period of life selection, and we kind of choose our general storylines. But then when we're in the games, we're free to make choices along many of those storylines, and we're free to like accept a quest or decline a quest along the way. And there are certain things that maybe, we're definitely going to do, and there's other things we might do. Like, for example, I never got a PhD. When I first graduated, I studied computer science at MIT, and then I went off to become an entrepreneur, and then I studied business at Stanford. But a lot of my friends did, and it was sort of one of these quests that I never took up at the time, and I decided to do it now, later in life, rather than earlier in life.
It's so interesting. I did the same thing when I got my master's degree. I got it like way later, and it was a quest. It was absolutely. It's interesting because I think you can tie reincarnation right into the game itself, because like the players, when they die, they do reincarnate. You get like so many times to come back, right? When you're playing a video game. So what's the tie-in there? I mean, do you think that was just another way to describe it?
Yeah, I think there's a clear tie-in there. And in fact, Nolan Bushnell, who was the founder of Atari, when they were making these arcade games, they started using this term multiple lives, right? And you get
Yeah,
so many lives. And in
that's right.
some cases, you start off right where your character died, but in
Right.
other cases, you get reset and you have to go back. But basically, it's like choosing a new character with a new body, uh, but you still have some of the same issues or karmic database
Oh,
uh,
geez.
that you have set up in the past. And so you're still pulling that, but you're pulling
Right.
it in with a new character. And so I think reincarnation just makes total sense when you look at it from the perspective of a video game, because you have the soul, the Atman, as it's called within the Hindu traditions, or the oversoul, as it's called within many kind of New Age
Mm.
traditions, that is going in and it's downloading all of its information. It's starting this new life, and then at the end, what do you do? Well, if you listen to near-death experiencers,
Oh, yeah.
many of them talk about a life review, uh,
Oh,
and the
most of
life
them
review,
do. Yeah,
yeah.
most of
And they talk about, I learned about it from a guy named Daniel Brinkley. Who knows, maybe you've had him on your show. He wrote Saved by the Light, was struck by
Oh, I've
lightning
heard of him, yeah.
way back when. And he wrote this book in the 90s that became a huge bestseller. And he called it a holographic panoramic life review. To
Wow.
where you were like back in the physical world, experiencing it, but from the other person's point of view.
Mhm,
And he
yes.
actually shot people when he was in the military. So he had to experience what it was like to be shot by
That shot,
himself.
yeah,
But then he had
yeah,
to see the ripple effect. Now,
yeah.
this was interesting to me because the same year that I was playing that game, the ping pong game, I got involved with another startup that was basically making a way to replay a game from your computer, a game called Counter-Strike Global Offensive. It was a
Mhm.
first-person shooter game, and you could be in the desert shooting people. And we could basically, you just played it on your screen. There was no virtual reality involved. But what this startup did was they would take that game and they would replay it for you. But you could do it with a virtual reality headset on. So you could literally go to any point in the virtual world, any XYZ coordinate, and you could see your character shoot the other character as if you were that other character. And so this got me thinking about the overlap. And since then I've talked with a lot of different people who've had near-death experiences, and the life review is basically can be explained. I mean, I'm an engineer at heart, right? So I like to say, well, if this is true, how would it work? Well,
Yeah.
it means everything is being recorded somewhere. And you're going to actually be able to review this in this virtual environment from this second person perspective, including the emotions. Now, we can't do that yet with our VR, but you can imagine something that's much more sophisticated, where you can replay not just any moment in time, but you can replay what people were feeling at the time as well. And that basically becomes the life review. And so just like at the end of a football game, what is the coach might, a professional NFL coach might play the video back and tell people,
Sure.
okay, we did this right, we did that wrong, we didn't do so well here. Or you can watch it yourself and say, if you're a boxer, you're going to watch the match and say, oh, I should have done this differently, I should have done that differently. That
Mm.
basically becomes the basis for the life review. And what was interesting to me was that as I started to look at the ancient scriptures of different religions, turns out the life review is there. They're just using different metaphors. So
Mm.
in the Bible, you have the book of life, which is often described as, St. Peter, looking and putting your name in the book if you go to heaven or not. But if you
Yeah.
go to the Jewish traditions and sort of the Old Testament, in those traditions, they're actually talking about the book of life as like a page for everybody. And on
Right.
that page are written all of the deeds
Exactly.
they did that would get them into heaven. And then in the Quran, they're even more explicit. They have what's called the scroll of deeds. And the scroll of deeds, there's two angels. You've probably seen like pictures of different angels. One is writing down your good deeds, and one
Yeah.
is writing down your bad deeds. And then it literally says at the end of your life, you have to open up the book and read what you did and see the ripple effects on other people. And now they're using the metaphor of a book and the metaphor of an angel. So this got me thinking, well, are there really angels, 7 billion angels that just sit there and do nothing more and write with feather pens that, Riz got on the podcast today, for example? Probably not. What language are they going to write in? So it's a metaphor. But what is it a metaphor of? It's a metaphor that things are being recorded. And so those angels, not necessarily talking about maybe the archangels, but those angels are more like functions or processes, computer processes that run all the time. They are serving a function, right? Just like St. Peter probably isn't really there to greet every single person as they go into heaven. That is a way to describe the function of a gatekeeper. And the recording angels, and there's, in Washington, D.C., you can see there's a statue of a recording angel, sitting there writing in the book of life.
Yeah.
And in Revelation.
It kind of reminds me of like the Akashic records, right?
Yes.
So that would be like the database, I guess.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And so I looked into the Hindu traditions, which is where the Akashic record comes from. It turns out they've got a very similar metaphor to try to describe this process. They've got a guy named Chitragupta. Mm-hmm. And who's Chitragupta? He's kind of one of these minor characters, right? If you think of the Hindu pantheon of gods, just like these angels that, from the Quran or Bible that are recording angels. And he is the record keeper. And he sits next to Yama. And Yama is the god of death. And so traditionally, the god of death decides when you die whether you're going to go on to a heavenly realm or a hellish realm or your next life. And Chitragupta is there, so he doesn't make a mistake. And what does Chitragupta do? He writes everything down in an actual book, which is called the Agra Sandhani, which is kind of like the Akashic Records is more of a broad term for everything. And so it turns out, the Egyptians have the metaphor of the feather. You're weighing your heart against the feather. Like what is it that they're talking about exactly there? They're using a technological metaphor. A scale is a technology. A book is a technology. So all the scriptures use often technological metaphors. I mean, they talk about gates, they talk about books, they talk about chariots, they talk about all kinds of things that are just technologies as a way for us to understand something maybe that is too complicated to put into words. And so what I'm proposing with this book is that simulation theory in the video game is the latest and best metaphor. And if Swami Yogananda were alive today, he would say it's like a movie, but it's interactive. And we're all actors. We're playing the movie, but we're also watching the movie. We all have a script, but we have free will to change the script so we can ad lib. So what does that sound like? It sounds like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game where we all have characters and we're all interacting with each other. So that became an interesting area of my research around how perhaps simulation theory is a connective thread that is a way to think about and reinterpret some of the scriptures. Not to say that they're wrong, but to say they're actually correct. They were just using language that people would understand 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. I remember seeing 2001: A Space Odyssey. Gosh, I think I was about in my teens. And that was so off the charts high tech back then. You had to watch that like 3 times to even try to understand. Do you think that we actually are in a simulation, or are you just using technology to explain the possibilities that we could be?
Well, so there's an access here. So I talked about the NPC versus RPG versions of the simulation hypothesis. And that's actually an access because you could have 100% characters, RPG avatars, all of whom have players or souls outside the body. Or you could have 100% we're in a simulation where everybody is just AI that's running again and again. Or you could have some mixture of the two. So it turns out that you can have both. So it's more like an axis, right? You could have half and half. And this is why I like the 13th floor as an example, because when they go into 1937, you have these characters living their lives, but they can inhabit one of those characters. So it's like they're taking over the avatar from outside. And I feel like we often go into NPC mode. Now, NPC is used sometimes online in a derogatory way as someone who doesn't think. But I think if we think of today where we have smart NPCs in games, which are like LLMs. And LLMs are conditioned off of a certain set of data, and they react off that data, and that's all they do. And we do the same thing in our current lives. We react based upon our traumas and our tribal or political affiliation or our religion or our whatever it is. And we're going into NPC mode. But when we connect back to our player, to our soul, we have to get over what's called the veil of forgetfulness. And so you can have a mixture of the two. Now, to get back to your question, which is a good one, is there's also an access, which is a quite literally, we are in a simulation. And then there's the metaphor of whether we're in a simulation. And I try to lay out both of those. But on the literal side, that's where I start to get into some of the information theory, some of the quantum physics, because what I found is when I looked into that stuff, that the universe operates in a very mysterious way. And it's a way that doesn't make a lot of sense if we were in a physical reality. Absolutely. But it does make sense if we're inside a virtual world.
Yep.
And that is that the universe consists of information more than it does of physical matter. Like most people are looking at this on their, say their phone or their, on their laptop. But if you look at the atoms, if you look inside, it's 99% empty space. And if you look at the atoms, it's also 99% empty space.
I know, it's crazy.
But if you keep going down, it's like those Russian dolls. You keep opening.
Yes.
So there was a physicist named John Wheeler who worked with Einstein at Princeton and Niels Bohr. As an aside, he was the supervisor of the guy that came up with the multiverse theory. We can talk about that, many worlds theory later. But he came up with a phrase towards the end of his life. And he said he kept looking for this thing called a particle, because the idea that we live in a physical world is this idea that there are these solid particles like my fist, right? It's a solid thing and there's another solid particle and you pack them together and we've got a solid object. So he kept looking for this thing called a particle. The only thing he could find when he got down to the bottom of the nested Russian dolls was like information. And he said, basically a particle is just an answer to a series of yes/no questions. And what is that? That's a 0 or a 1 or a bit of information.
Right.
So he came up with this phrase, it from bit. And basically what he said is if anything looks like looks like an actual object, it actually consists at the bottom level just of bits of information. And so I think that idea that the world is based on information, it used to be controversial. Like you go back 50 years, people would say you're crazy.
Yeah.
There's a great video clip of the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, whose books were the basis
he's phenomenal.
Blade Runner and Minority Report and Total Recall and The Man in the High Castle. So I interviewed his wife when I was writing this book. And,
oh, wow.
And she told me to go back and look at, because he has a famous line from a speech in Metz, France, and from 1977. And so people can find this online, but all the way back in 1977, he said, we are living in a computer programmed reality. And the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed, some alteration in our reality occurs. Now, if you watch the video, you look at the audience after he said that, and people were like, what are you talking about? You must be nuts, right? But the truth is today, physicists won't necessarily argue with that point. Last year, I was at the University of Cambridge for a semester in the UK. And there was a Nobel Prize winning physicist I met there. And he said, he was asking about simulation theory, and he said, that's not really controversial anymore that the world consists of information.
Right.
So that is the basis of simulation theory too. Now you can argue, how does that information get to be perceived as if we are in a physical world? We don't fully understand that. We don't understand consciousness. So there are all these things we don't understand. But in quantum mechanics, one of the things that happens is you have this probability wave, right? From the double slit experiment that has different states of a particle or different slits that it might go through. And then it's only when it's observed or detected.
Yeah, crazy.
It actually collapses down to one. And to me, to me, with my background in video games, that's how we build video games. We don't render everything. We just leave things in a state of information and probability. And then we render only that part of the world that your character or avatar can see. Just like today, like, I mean, I can't see, your whole house. I can just see you, and you can see like my office, but you can't see beyond that, because that would be too much information. So most of computer science is about how do you optimize information storage. And the only reason we're able to do this streaming on my computer, or I can watch Game of Thrones on my phone, right, is because they were able to compress all that information down.
Right.
So it's all about optimization. And so one of the things that I propose in the book is that quantum indeterminacy, or the observer effect, is actually a kind of optimization routine, so that the universe only renders that which is observed.
Gosh, that makes so much sense, because it's almost like when you zoom in, the pixels get pixelated, like you can
Right.
see. It's crazy when you put it that way. But I wanted to talk more about sorry, that's my dog. He's a little barker. Oliver, stop it. Little dogs love to bark. So,
Oh yeah, definitely.
I wanted to talk about quantum entanglement more, and that double slit experiment, because that whole thing is beyond imagination. Like the observer part, they tried to trick the experiment by unplugging the observer, and it knew. Like, could you talk about that to try to help us understand?
Yeah, well, first of all, Niels Bohr, who's one of the fathers of quantum mechanics, said, that those who are not shocked by the quantum theory have not understood it. Right? And Richard Feynman, who is a Nobel Prize winner from Caltech, he was also on the Challenger, the NASA Challenger committee, for example. He said nobody understands quantum mechanics, and the reason why is because it doesn't make sense from our point of view. But the basic idea is that when the particle goes through one of two slits, it's in a state that they call superposition, which means it has both values. Now, a good way to understand this is Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger was another father of quantum mechanics. He came up with the Schrodinger wave equation. And he actually didn't like this idea that there were all these probabilities, so he tried to come up with this way to explain it with his cat. And he said, basically, if there's some radioactive material in a box with a cat, and after an hour, the cat has a 50% chance of being alive or a 50% chance of being dead. Which is it? Now, common sense tells us that the cat is either alive or dead. It can't be both.
Right.
I mean,
it's binary
we
choice.
just don't know because we haven't looked in the box.
Right.
But that's not what quantum mechanics tells us. What quantum mechanics tells us is that the cat is in a state of superposition. Superposition means a superset of two different positions, alive or dead. So the cat is both alive and dead until somebody opens up the box and looks. Now, one way to do that is with the detector. You could put a little video camera in there, right?
Right.
And so the video camera would record. And so you can also unplug the video camera. So even though the video camera is in there, it still stays in a state of superposition if it's not actually recorded. And so this gets really weird. Okay, if you want to know an even weirder aspect of quantum mechanics, it's called the delay choice double slit experiment, which is that they put the detector not at the slits, but after the slits.
I saw that.
It would have to go through one or the other slit to get to the detector.
Right.
But what happens is when it goes through one or both, so if it's a wave, it goes through both. If it's a particle, it has to go through one or the other. And what they're saying is when it gets detected, it's as if it went through one or the other. But if they don't decide whether the detector is going to be there until after it's gone through the slits, that means the decision is made afterwards about which of the two slits it went through. Okay, now if anybody's curious about this, look up what's called the cosmic delayed choice experiment. And this is actually a simpler way to explain it. Suppose there's light coming from a quasar that's 1 billion light years away.
Mm-hmm.
That means that the light will take 1 billion years to get all the
Right.
way here. Now, let's suppose there's something in the middle, like a black hole, and the light has to go to the right or to the left of the black hole.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same as two slits now. It's going to the right or
Yeah.
the left of the black hole. And we on Earth can detect with telescopes whether it went left or right using some polarization of light. Now, suppose that's halfway between the quasar and us. That's 500 million light years away. So the decision of whether to go to the left or the right would have to have been made 500 million years ago. And that's the time of the dinosaurs. But what quantum mechanics and the delayed choice double slit experiment are telling us, it's not until the measurement is made today that it's decided whether it went to the left or to the right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's touching on some really weird phenomena around time.
Yeah.
How is it that something that happened at the time of dinosaurs can change now based on how we measure it? It's like a kind of retro causality. So the simulation hypothesis tells us that the physical world may not be what we think it is. The delayed choice experiment, which I get into in this book, but I get into it a lot more in my other book called The Simulated Multiverse, basically is telling us that time is not what we think it is. Time is something else. Now, if you've ever played Minecraft or your kids have played Minecraft, or if you remember a game called Farmville, do you remember that on Facebook?
Sure.
It was extremely popular at one point.
Oh, yeah.
Now, what happened is you would plant these crops, and then you go away and you come back the next day, and then they'll tell you what happened to your crops in those 24 hours. Like, did they grow? Were there some locusts? Did a rabbit come and eat your carrots? Whatever the case may be. Now, the way video games work is it doesn't sit there and compute all that in real, like at the time that it's supposed to happen. It's only when you log back in that it fills in the past. And so as it fills in the past, it's kind of generating the past on demand based on a set of probabilities that the game designers have already put in there. Like there's a 30% chance there's going to be a rainstorm. There's a 50% chance, there's going to be locusts. There's a 10% chance there's going to be a drought, right? All these things, it'll tell you what happened in the last 24 hours. But if you extend that to say the last 100 years or last million years, you can see that quantum mechanics to me is suggesting that things are only rendered when they're needed. And that includes the past. The past also gets rendered as it's necessary, which raises a possibility of multiple timelines, that maybe there's more than one possible past. And so this is what my book, The Simulated Multiverse, is about this idea that you may have multiple timelines. And so going back to what I said earlier, I interviewed Philip K. Dick's wife, Tessa, and she said to me, well, go back and watch that whole speech from Metz, France, not just the one famous line that everybody quotes. And so I went back and watched the whole speech, and then I read it. And it turns out what that speech was actually about was about basically going back in time, changing a variable, and rerunning the simulation forward. And that's where he came up with his idea for The Man in the High Castle, which, if anybody has seen that series on Amazon, I don't know, have you seen it?
Not yet, but I'm going to.
It's a really good series, and it's about a alternate timeline where Germany and Japan and the Axis powers won World War II, whereas in our timeline, obviously, it was the Allies. It was the Americans, the Soviets, the British who won World War II. But in that timeline, America is divided between the German Empire and the Japanese Empire at that time. And he goes through this entire set. And so he claimed, he's a science fiction writer, but he claimed that when he wrote it because of partial fragmentary memories. But then later, he had an experience where he got all of the memories of that timeline back. And she said that he was going to write a sequel, but he never did. Because at that point he had all those memories and he remembered America as the slave state and he just didn't want to go there. But that's a good way to illustrate this idea that maybe there's more than one possible past, which touches on another phenomenon called the Mandela effect that people have reported.
That's huge right now. That's huge. how do our brains play into this? Because I've seen and read about studies that, especially now with fMRIs and stuff like that, where they can tell a second before you make a decision that you're going to make a decision based on
Mm.
your brain patterns and I guess the colors that it, reads however they read them. So how do you think the brain plays into this simulation? If my brain knows milliseconds before I make a decision what I'm going to do or say, how does the brain fit into this?
Well, so the brain becomes our main control panel, if you will, for our character in the simulation theory. And so,
Right.
uh, if you think about like video games, it's a good way to think about this because competitive video games where people are like shooting at each other, they're using a mouse, let's say, or a
Right.
controller, and they're pressing the buttons. And what happens is it takes some amount of time, like 100 milliseconds, from the time they made the decision to get to their arm to their
Right.
hand to
Right.
move the mouse. Okay. And so the player makes the decision or is reacting, and then it takes time to go through the electrical circuitry to get to, and then you have to move the mouse, and then the mouse takes time as well
Sure.
to render, and it has to travel all the way to the server from your. So there's a delay that happens from a gaming perspective. Now, there was a group that was testing out where they would put a controller that would measure your muscle, this thing called EMGs, or it's
Mm,
like a muscular
sure.
electrical current or something in your muscles. They would gain like 100 milliseconds in competitive video gaming because they were faster now because they didn't have to wait for the signal to get all the way there. And so it's very possible that that's happening at another level beyond this, which is we, the character, aren't necessarily fully conscious of it, but our player has made the decision, sends it in, and it takes a certain amount of time for that to process through the chemical infrastructure of the brain, which is actually not as fast as electricity. It's actually a chemical infrastructure that we're making. And that's kind of what they're referring to there, where the brain has made the decision before you actually are conscious of it, because consciousness takes a certain amount of processing of
Mm,
neurons, et cetera, in
yeah.
our character, right? And so that's one way to explain that. Now, consciousness is a big open question. So some people think it's just an emergent property of the neurons, and that's it. Others say it's consciousness is fundamental, and it comes in, and that actually parallels the NPC versus RPG versions of the simulation
Mm,
hypothesis, which is, in the one hand, you can have free will because it's coming from outside of the system,
right.
right? Video games don't have 100% freedom of choice. It might look like it in a game like Grand Theft Auto, which is an open world game where you can decide what to do next, but the video game designers have already kind of given you pathways. Now you can decide which
Sure.
of those pathways to take, and there's almost an infinite number of combinations because there's so many choices now. But back in the old days, they used to have like these little dialogue trees. I
Oh,
was
yeah.
playing an old game called Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, which was built by Lucasfilm back in the 90s, I think, or something, as an adventure game. I was playing it on an emulator. I never played it back then, but it's a fun game. But you have little dialogue trees that says, speak to this person, and then they talk to you, and then here's the choices you have
I
to make.
remember that.
And maybe we're doing something similar to that at a much higher level. I think that our players are doing that as part of our lives.
Yeah. So the quantum entanglement thing we were talking about before, how does that tie into the multiverse? Because I've even read where quantum computing can
Yes.
tap into the multiverse and actually pull information. What's
Yeah,
that all?
so that's really interesting. And
Yeah.
in fact, my thinking on the type of computer that you would need to run a universe as complicated as ours, it's not, you can't do it on an iPhone, right? You can't do it even on today's supercomputers. They just don't have enough processing power.
No.
But turns out quantum computers, which are still in their infancy, can actually um, do the type of processing that we're talking about in terms of making quantum decisions. And so quantum computing is a new type of computing, and it's very different from regular computing. So we're kind of in the phase that we were back in the 60s and early 70s. Right? It was before the PCs came out. It was before the Apple I, which was just really a kind of a motherboard. Anyway, the Apple II was the first real computer that had like a full keyboard and everything integrated, other than prototypes. But so in quantum computing, they have what's called a qubit, Q-U-B-I-T, which is a quantum bit. And what they say is in a classical computer, like in my computer, all the bits have a value of either 0 or 1. And then, you add the bits, and, when you get like whatever, a JPEG file that's like 300 kilobytes, right? And those are, what does that mean? It means that's 300 kilobytes. Each byte is 8 bits. So that's exactly how many bits you have. And every one of those has a 0 or a 1 in there, definitively. Compression helps you reduce that. Incidentally, if you've ever tried, so one of my main points in the book is that computer science is often about optimization. If you look at a JPEG file, it's a small file typically because it's compressed. If you ever try to save that in an uncompressed TIFF, you would go from like 300K to 100 megabytes just for one file. I mean, it's huge. And back then, there was no way anybody could, transfer those files on the internet when we were using, modems to do that. And so back to quantum computing then. In quantum computing, a bit is in superposition. It's called a qubit, a quantum bit, which means it has a value of both 0 or 1 until such time that the computation measures, or let's say observes, because I think that's a more fun way to talk about this with the observer effect. But your program says, okay, put these bits in superposition until I need to measure it. And if you do that, theoretically, it can explore all of those possible values.
Wow.
Now, if you think of that, if you think of like 4 bits, really simple, 4 bits, each can have a value of 0 or 1, or even 3 bits, make it really simple. So the total possible number of values is 2 to the 3rd power, which is 8. There's only 8 possible values. Now, that's easy. Any computer can go through 8 different values and figure out what the right one is. But now go to 64 bits. Okay, now you're talking about 2 to the 64.
Yeah.
And this is a problem that grows exponentially. So there's an old story of the king and the chessboard in India that demonstrates how big these numbers can be. And the reason I tell it is because quantum computers are good at solving problems that grow exponentially. And so there was a king, he loved to play chess, and after a while he beat everybody and nobody would play chess with him. And he said, there was a wise man or a yogi or a sage, he wanted him to play chess with me. He goes, nah, I don't want to. He goes, I'll give you anything you want. He goes, okay, how about this? If I win, you give me 1 grain of rice for the first square in the chessboard. And then you double that for the second square. So you get 2 grains of rice. And you double that again. So you get 4 grains of rice. And then you get 8 grains of rice. And you get 16 grains of rice.
Right.
And the king is like, sure, no big deal. That's simple enough. So the wise man wins. And it turns out he needs 2 to the 64 grains of rice, which is like 18 quintillion, which is more rice than could fit in all of India.
Right.
And so, but quantum computers theoretically are starting to get to that point where they can solve a problem that has that many different options. And nobody knows how that works because theoretically they can even solve encryption. Now, we're not there yet. We don't have enough qubits, but once you get enough qubits, theoretically they would solve like encryption problems that are 2 to the 512th power or 2 to the 1024th power, which requires more computations than there are atoms in the entire physical universe.
Jesus. Well,
and
Riz,
so they're trying to figure out how could.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say. So they're trying to figure out how is that possible. And there's a quantum computer expert and physicist named David Deutsch at Oxford. And he says, well, because it's exploring the multiverse, it's exploring all the different possible options and coming back with the right one instantly because it's all being done in different. Well, now it can solve a problem that would take not like a year for my laptop to solve, but it would take like 1,000,000 years for my laptop to solve, right? Using a classical algorithm. And it could do it relatively quickly, almost instantly. Now, how's that possible? It's because it can explore all of these options in parallel. And that's why I like to use that term, which is a technical term, superposition. So if you have 3 bits, if you have 64 bits and they're in superposition, basically you are representing all of the 18 quintillion states at once, just with 64 qubits. And we're starting to get to that point where we would have 64 qubits. And so the multiverse, by the way, is an alternate explanation for the observer effect. So scientists don't like to talk about consciousness, right? A lot of them, physicists, and they're like, this observer effect thing is too bizarre, right? It requires an observer.
It really is. So this quantum computing stuff is absolutely mind-blowing. And every time I talk to people about it, they always say, well, nobody knows for sure. Nobody really understands, but somebody has to be understanding and knowing what's going on if we're creating this.
So this is how this came about. And so the idea behind the simulation hypothesis is that the world is a computer program running on some type of computer.
Right.
It's hard to say what exactly the program is or what type of computer it's running on. And so what happened was I was giving a talk in Boston. We did a screening of The Matrix this last summer.
Oh, wow.
Which was a lot of fun. And I gave a little talk about simulation theory. And this woman came up to me afterwards because I was selling books to sign the books. And she bought like 3 books. She's like, can you sign these? And I was like, wow, that's cool. And she was like this big Caribbean looking woman. And I was like, that's interesting. Why is she buying 3 books? And she goes, oh, I want to introduce myself. My name is Joyce Fredkin. And I'm the wife of the now passed gentleman named Ed Fredkin. Now, who is Ed Fredkin? Well, he just passed a few years ago, and you can look up his obituary in the New York Times. And he was one of the first computer science professors at MIT.
Oh, wow.
He was an entrepreneur, made a ton of money, and he started to explore something called cellular automata. Now, you've probably heard of this term. I mean, cellular automata is when you have like a bunch of squares and they follow certain rules. And there's it could be like a single row called an elementary cellular automata, or it could be like a 2-dimensional. There's something called a game of life. And it just follows these rules. And the rules are simple, really simple. Like if the next square is lit up and the square to my left is also lit up and my right is also lit up, then I'll light up the square. But if the one to, the north of me or south of me isn't lit up, then I won't light up. It's just a bunch of rules. But these rules basically become more and more complex. So there's a whole field now called chaos theory and complexity theory, which is about this idea that a computer process, even if it's deterministic, okay, so cellular automata are 100% deterministic. I mean, you tell it exactly what the rules are, and theoretically you can, trace through and find out what will happen at step 1 million or 2 million. But there's a term that Stephen Wolfram, who's a physicist who turned computer scientist, who came up with this term computationally irreducible. He said, you can't know what's going to happen, even for a deterministic process, until you run the whole program, until you get there. And so you have to run the process to 1,999,999, and then you can find out what's going to happen for a chaotic or a complex process. You may have heard the 3-body problem, which is a science fiction novel from a Chinese writer that was translated in English, but it's based on the problem of what will happen with 3 bodies. Even with 3 bodies, it's hard to figure out what's going to happen in 100 million years. Will they be stable? Will one fly off? And you don't know. You can't just predict it with the math. You have to actually run the process. And so this whole idea of processes in nature. So Ed Fredkin was one of the experts. So he went to Caltech and spent a year with Richard Feynman. And Richard Feynman, who had already won the Nobel Prize for something else at that point, basically taught him about physics. And he taught Feynman about quantum physics. And he taught Feynman about computer programs. So Feynman started to learn about computer programs. And so he was trying to figure out how would you simulate some of these quantum processes that we already know about. But classical computers can't simulate them. Yeah. And so he wrote a paper about, can we use quantum elements as computational devices? Can we use atoms or electrons or photons and they already do this superposition thing, right? We already know that from quantum physics, that particles, subatomic particles, and even photons, which are, you could argue whether it's a particle or not. It gets back to this wave or particle idea. But they already exhibit this behavior. Can we use that as a way of quantum computing? And then in the 90s, a guy named Seth Lloyd and David Deutsch and a bunch of other people started to come up with these algorithms and try to build these computers. And so now it's getting to the point where we can build them. The problem is you need like superconductors right now to keep these quantum bits. What happens is quantum bits can influence each other, just like particles in the air. And so you need a lot of error correction. In fact, one of the reasons we're able to have this conversation is because of the information theory from a guy named Claude Shannon, who was an MIT professor back in the 1900s and 1950. He came up with this. He was a contemporary of Alan Turing, but he came up with information theory, which is how much information is being sent in a particular stream or a particular package. And other people came up with these error codes. So the reason my computer can make your picture exactly like the way you sent it is because it would get messed up along the way on the wires, because the wires are still using voltages. Right. We're still using voltages here. And so they came up with these error correction algorithms that says if you have like 1,000 ones in a row or 500 ones and 500 zeros, you can measure that and say, oh, there's an error. Let's go back and get the right value. And so what makes quantum computers complicated today is that the error correction, you have to run the same program 1,000 times. I mean, it works quickly, but the problem is there might have been an error in one of these qubits. And so you have to run it 1,000 times to make sure you got the same answer. And the majority of times, whatever the majority answer is. Now, there are newer quantum computers that are in the works that won't require superconducting and will have, they have algorithms in there for error correction. So you don't need a lot of qubits to add to the data. So anyway, that's kind of we might have gone a little too much in detail there.
Oh, no, it's awesome. So these quantum computers, they won't need like super cooling rooms that are soundproof. They will be able to have them, do you think, like in our PCs or
eventually, not our existing PCs. It's going to require different hardware. It's not at that stage yet. I mean, you can on your own in your browser, you can run a quantum program. You can go to IBM and they have like an open place where you can write in some code, or Microsoft has, I think, Q#, and they will run it on their quantum computer, which is still a room-sized computer.
I would imagine. So we've got a long way to go before, because AI almost seems, the speed that it works when you ask it a question or want it to create a video, that's a little bit slower, but it almost seems like it's quantum at the speed it's going through all the data that exists.
Well, what happens is they train it on all that data beforehand. So it's actually quite slow, and it requires GPUs, which is why NVIDIA, the company NVIDIA, if people watch the stock price, has gotten to be so big because they started making these for video games, by the way. GPUs are graphics processing units for video games.
I remember,
Yeah, and now it turns out they're also quite useful for cryptocurrency mining, and then it turns out they're also good for AI training and AI resolution. Now, those are still classical computers. They still follow, all the rules, AND gates, OR gates, all the stuff I learned when I was at MIT a couple decades ago. It's still pretty much the same stuff under the hood, but they have a lot of them. If you might have heard the story recently where XAI, Elon Musk's AI company, which is now owns Twitter, and Grok is their AI. They set up 100,000 GPU installation in I don't know how many days, in a month, but they thought it was going to take a year. But that's why it seems like it's relatively quick, is because they have the 100,000 GPUs doing all the training beforehand. It's still slow from our perspective because it has to go out over the internet to the server, and then the server has to use the GPUs to do what's called the inference or the resolution.
Right.
And so they're not using quantum computers yet. But that said, if you think about it, I mean, you had a good insight there, which is they're kind of going through all the knowledge, right, that they have. It's almost like they're going through a multiverse of different possibilities. and they're assigning probabilities, and they're coming up with the best probability. I mean, that's how they work. They're more of a probability thing, but that's only because of what they've been trained on. And now they've been trained on so much text that most people think it has passed, the Turing test, which was this test that's been out for a while, saying if you talk to an AI or you talk to a computer and you can't tell the difference, then the computer or the AI has passed. I mean, sorry, if you talk to a human or you talk to a computer and you can't tell the difference. You can't tell the difference between the human or the computer, then that computer has passed the Turing test, which Alan Turing wrote a paper on it. He called it the imitation game in 1950. And for years, there was a prize for the best chatbot, the little chatbots that existed before ChatGPT. There was something called a Loebner Prize. In fact, if you've seen the film Her, have you ever seen that movie with
I don't think
Joaquin
so.
Phoenix, and Scarlett Johansson was the voice of his AI girlfriend? And when OpenAI came out with their ChatGPT version last year, they put out some videos where it looked like he was talking to his AI girlfriend, and they wanted to use Scarlett Johansson's voice, but she didn't want to be part of it. And they started, and they used a voice similar to hers, and it started this whole lawsuit where she was trying to sue them for using a voice that sounded like hers, but she played the character, and it was like a chatbot. Well, what people don't know is that the movie Her, Spike Jonze, the guy who created it, saw an earlier chatbot called the Alice chatbot, which was one of the first that had like a personality of a young girl. So they called it Alice, but it was actually an acronym for something. I forget exactly what, A.L.I.C.E. So that inspired him to create this sci-fi vision. And now, we're seeing that come out. But there's something that in my book, in the new second edition of the Simulation Hypothesis, I have something called the Metaverse Turing Test. And we should be getting there soon. I don't think we've quite got there yet, but basically it's you have your character in a video game that you're controlling, and there's another character that's being controlled by AI, and you have to talk to it, and it can talk to you and listen to you. That part it can probably do already, but you have to do things in the virtual world. And you could have a group of people and see how that character is interacting with other people. You might go skiing, you might go swimming, you might go flying, parachute, all that stuff. And if you can't tell the difference, then it ends up passing that test. So I'm forgetting the original question though you asked that got me down this road.
It's great. I mean, we're all over, but I love it. I love it. It's interesting too because we're told that we're here to learn lessons. Like, if you get into religion and esoterics and things like that, right? Gnostic studies, we're here to learn hard lessons. And these lessons are given to us by our determinant. Like we choose what pain we want to experience. And of course, like you said, we have this veil of forgetfulness. So we don't really know our past lives or why we chose to live in this existence. So if you look at people that are on this earth that are poverty stricken, living in terrible conditions, children that suffer, I think it was Descartes that said he didn't believe in God because of the suffering of children. Like that alone, I think it was him.
Maybe it was somebody else. I don't know. We can look it up. But
somebody, we have to look that up. But somebody said that, and it kind of made sense to me because how could you justify the suffering of innocence, right? So if we're in this video game, why are we choosing such bad avatars? Like, why? It doesn't make sense to me. Do you think it's because of the lesson thing that we have to learn? I don't know. You make sense of that.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's, one of the it's the problem of, I think the religious scholars call it theodicy, this problem of if there's suffering, then there can't be a God. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I don't think most religions, would say that. In fact, part of if we are in a video game, which is, what I'm proposing here, then the nature of the game is how we treat other people. But in order to make the game interesting, there has to be challenges. There has to be opportunities for people to treat other people badly. And so part of the nature of the game I think you can tell it by how you're measured at the end of the game. And so if the life review is real, where you're
Mm,
going back and saying, how did I treat this person? When I was in the military, I shot this guy. What happened to his wife and his kids? They experienced a lot of suffering and sadness. And
exactly.
now I have to experience that too. And that was not something I should have done. So how can you improve if you don't have that kind of environment where you can have
Mm,
that kind of suffering? And in fact, it may be that the advanced players are the ones who are going through more suffering. There's something
ah,
we call a difficulty level, right? You don't go to the highest difficulty level of the game right away. You start off at an easy difficulty level, and then you
oh
develop
my
over time
God.
to go to the more difficult. So is it possible? And I'm not trying to minimize anyone's suffering.
No, no.
I think most religious and spiritual people, whether you're religious or not, but if you're spiritual, you recognize that there's a lot of suffering in the world.
Yes.
Yogananda said the nature of this world is not ceaseless joy. Right? But he
Right.
also called it the warp and the woof of Maya, which is the warp and the woof of the illusion. And so within this illusory world, it's like the actors who win the Academy Awards. What do they win for? Usually it's for parts that are extremely difficult. When did
Right.
Tom Hanks win his first Academy Award? It was for playing that character who had AIDS in the 90s, was it? Philadelphia, I think it was called.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's the more difficult roles that
yeah.
later, and so those may in fact be the more advanced, if you will. So I don't think the nature of our game is Grand Theft Auto, where your goal is to abuse everyone else and take everything. But there are people who think that that's the nature of the game, is how much money you die with, or etc.
Yeah.
And but if we are to trust any of the old religious texts, or we just to trust the more contemporary near-death experience reports, we see there is a review of the game, but it's not at all what a rationalist might necessarily think it is. It's about how you treat other people. That's one aspect. What's the other? So within near-death experiences, there's usually a being of light or an angel, depending on who you're talking to.
Mhm.
And so the ones that do the life review with you, turns out they don't judge you, you're judging yourself. But there's a question they often ask. And sometimes people will say, God asked me this question, or Jesus Christ asked me this question. And the question is, what did you make of your life? And that leads into the life review. But so it's touching on how you treated other people, but also I think it presupposes a previous question, which is, what are you planning to do with your life? And so there's
Yeah,
something called a life preview as
right.
well. And if you look at the work of Dr. Michael Newton, who wrote Journey of Souls, or Dolores Cannon,
Oh,
or
yeah.
there was another psychiatrist in Toronto who published a book on this even earlier than either of those two. It's called Life Between Life, where he regressed people. They talk about a planning phase where you're watching on a screen. So it's almost like a technological metaphor. You're
Mhm.
watching on a screen what might happen in your life, and they actually see it happening. And sometimes in near-death experiences, particularly mothers, they'll see when they get a choice whether to come back or to stay. Of course, they want to stay in the afterlife because there's no pain and suffering and
Right,
everything's great.
right.
But then they see what will happen to their children. Now, what are they seeing? They're seeing a preview of what might happen if they stay. And of course, as a mother of young children, you're going to say, okay, I'll go back for my children because I don't want them to experience X, Y, or Z. I remember one
Yeah.
life review where even that wasn't enough to convince her, and they had to show what was going to happen to her mother, if her child had died,
Oh,
and how
wow.
distraught she would be. And she was like, okay, fine. My children are going to be fine. My husband's going to be fine, but my mom won't be. So let me go back. And so I find that intriguing. And so life previews and life reviews, I think there is an element of choice, gets back to this life selection, but
Mm,
before, and that leads to the free will versus, you
yeah,
know,
that
everything
makes the
being
most sense.
destined.
Yeah.
And I think if you think of a grid where you have a set of choices, each of those choices goes out to this big grid, but you can still get to do, and that's almost like a multiverse. Okay, if you
Yeah.
think of all the different choices you can make, each of those timelines is like a multiverse? And is it possible that the simulation lets us preview those? And that even while we're here, we have a writer's room, which would consist of, say, our soul, which is our player, maybe our guides or coaches who are like the directors, and some other players, other actors who are in the scene with us. And maybe they have laid out the storyline of season 2, but they haven't yet written all the episodes. And so they're like, okay, what are we going to throw them in episode 2? What kind of crazy stuff are we going to have happen to them in episode 3? And maybe some of the people that are suffering, part of the reason that they've agreed to do that is to give other people the choice of how they're going to treat them, whether it's a karmic type of situation, or it gives them the ability to show compassion. It's a very complicated question, and it's been there for thousands of years.
It is
but
very
I think the video game metaphor at least lets us realize that
it does work. You talk about the Mandela effect. We kind of talked a little bit about that before, and you discussed in your book that it's this like collective false memories. And it has a potential like aversion control issue in the simulation. Do you think that these glitches are, or they're intentional like updates to the software? I mean, I've experienced the Mandela effect myself.
Which one? Which one have you experienced?
I've experienced several. The one that bugs me the most is the Fruit of the Loom thing, because I specifically remember. I mean, I had T-shirts for my kids that had underwear with the cornucopia in them. So I knew that, so stuff like that, a lot of stuff like that made me crazy. And then we've all had deja vus. I just had one not long ago. Sometimes I could be talking to someone I'm interviewing and I get a deja vu and it blows me away. Like I know I had this conversation with this person before. What do you think counts for that? Software glitches, what are they?
Yeah. Well, so I went down this rabbit hole deeply in my other simulation book called The Simulated Multiverse, about quantum computers, multiverse, parallel universes, and the Mandela effect. And as I said earlier, Philip K. Dick's wife asked me to rewatch his speech. And when I watched the whole speech and then I read the whole speech, I realized that he was actually talking about changing variables and rerunning the events. And so I'll expand the quote that I gave you earlier, which was, "We are living in a computer programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed, some alteration in our reality occurs." Now, the next sentence he says is, "We would have the sense that we were reliving the same events, deja vu, if you will, or re-saying the same words. Such a perception, let's say the deja vu, is a clue," he called it, "that at some point in the past, an alteration was made and the program was rerun." And so if you rerun a program, and this is the art of complexity science. So complexity science and chaos theory, if anyone's ever watched Jurassic Park, remember Ian Malcolm, who was Jeff Goldblum's character. He kept saying, "I'm a chaotician, not a mathematician," right? And that's when chaos theory was relatively new. But the whole idea of chaos theory is that small changes might cause big changes down the road. Small changes in initial conditions might change a lot of things down the road.
Okay.
And that's like the butterfly effect. They say, well, what if the butterfly flaps its wings in Hong Kong and the stock market crashes in London, New York? Well, that's very complex. You don't know what the heck happened. But there may be a series of causes that happen along the way. And so if you change the initial conditions, you change the outcome. Now, some of those are big things, but some of those are minor things as well. And so the Mandela effect, I use it as a way to think about this idea of multiple timelines, that in fact, these times might happen. Let me go back to the Philip K. Dick speech. At one point he goes, "Some people talk about past lives. I remember an alternate present." And I don't know too many people that do, although I suspect there are other people who might remember this. And what he said was, we would need to find a group of people who remembered a different history. Now, back then in 1977, that wasn't so easy to do. And so the Mandela effect was coined by a blogger named Fiona Broom in 2010. And she was in Atlanta at one of these Comic-Con conventions they have there called Dragon Con.
Oh yeah.
And she was at the Star Trek panel. And so they had some actors from the original Star Trek. Now, if you know any Star Trek fans, they know their Star Trek pretty well, right? The Trekkies and the Trekkers. And they were asking the actors about a particular episode where a particular thing happened. And the actors were like, we never filmed that episode. And many people in the audience were like, yeah, we remember that episode. And so that got her thinking. And then she found out that many people remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison. And then that ended up leading to the term the Mandela effect. Of course, in our timeline, Mandela didn't die in prison. He got out. He became president of South Africa. And yet people remember his funeral. They remember his wife, Winnie, taking over the party. And,
I remember that.
You do. U.S. presidents being there. It's really detailed. And so where I ended up with this was I used the Mandela effect as a way to explain that if we were in a simulated universe, it just means that there was a previous run, and some of us are remembering the memory from that previous run, and others are remembering it from the current run of the simulation. So it could be basically a clue that some variable was changed, and it's led small and large changes in the past. Now, some of the Mandela effects may just be misremembering, like the most famous one is The Empire Strikes Back, where Darth Vader, says, Luke, I am your father. But turns out he didn't really say that. He said, no, I am your father. Or a letter change here, although some of those letter changes are significant, like the Bernstein Bears and the Bernstein Bears, where people say, Jewish people will say, I asked my mom, why are these bears Jewish? Like, they probably wouldn't have done that if it was S-T-A-I-N rather than S-T-A-N. So the closer you are to something and the more vivid your memory. My favorite one, by the way, is a Mandela effect that I don't remember, but people have told me about, is the one in Tiananmen Square, which is, remember the tank, the guy standing in front of the tank?
God, yeah.
Yeah, you remember that, 1989. Did the tank run over the guy or not? Do you remember?
No, it stopped.
Yeah, that's what I remember. But there is a subset of people, and that's what defines a Mandela effect. It's usually the majority remember one thing, but a minority remember something else, who say that not only did it run him over, that was the bloodiest thing they ever saw on TV.
God, I didn't know that. There was an alternate memory for that.
There's an alternate memory. And, I was at Contact in the Desert, which is a conference in Palm Springs, and we had a panel. I was there with Paul Hynek and a few other people, who is the son of Alan Hynek. And somehow we got to talking about this. And so I said, of the 5 people on the panel, how many of you remember Tank Boy being this way versus that way? And it was 2 people remembered it being run over, and one of them really remembered it super vividly. And so I think your significance or proximity to it, I can give you an interesting alternate explanation.
Yeah.
That ties into the mystical side, or the esoteric side. So I think that some of the more interesting Mandela effects are the Bible changes, the scripture changes.
I've heard of them. Yeah.
Like Isaiah being the most famous one about the lion and the lamb. And, people have pictures of a lion and a lamb. And some people say, look, they still have the same King James Bible. I thought, maybe it's a different translation. Maybe it's a new edition. They just changed it a little bit because they translated, from the Latin, which translated from whether it's Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever it is. And they said, no, I literally have the same physical Bible I had when I was a kid, and now it's changed. And so I began to wonder, has this happened in other scriptures, not just the Bible? And so I started to look around for the Quran. And if you know anything about the Quran, it's memorized word for word. There's a whole group of priests called Hafiz, and all they do to get that designation is you have to be able to say the entire book. It's not as big as the Bible. It's a little bit easier, but it's still pretty difficult. It's all in Arabic too.
Yeah.
And so I began to wonder, has anyone noticed any changes in this? And there was one Sufi imam. Sufi is kind of the esoteric side of, just like we have the Gnostics with Christians, and you have the Kabbalists with the Jewish tradition. You have the Sufis in Islam. And there was a Sufi imam, and he said basically that one of the esoteric reasons why they memorized the Quran. There was probably a practical reason for it back in the day when everybody couldn't read and write.
Sure.
He said was because there are beings that are non-human who experience space and time differently than we do. And those beings can go back in time and they can change things. They can change physical objects, but they're not allowed to change our memory. And those are called the jinn. Of course, we know about this from
Oh,
Aladdin. We had the genies from
yeah.
Aladdin, right? And so I heard that and I thought that was really interesting because it gets back to exactly what Philip K. Dick was talking about, that certain beings, he called them the programmer and the counter programmer, can go back and change variables. And so if you do that, things may run a little differently. Some things may run almost exactly the same and only have slight differences. Like the Ford logo, has a longer line or a shorter line, or the cornucopia. Now, there are logical explanations for some of these, and the mainstream explanation is it's just bad memory. But it's the exception cases that I find quite interesting, the ones where people remember really vividly, or they know a subject really well. Another one of my favorites is the thinker. Do you remember the thinker?
Of course. Did that change? Because, yeah, it was something to do with his hand placement, right?
Yes. So if you look, and like they have a cast of it at Stanford when I lived in the Bay Area, and it's under his chin.
Yes.
Then there's a number of people who are standing next to it with their hand up here on their forehead in the picture. And of course, in the picture. And then I went back and I found a picture from the 1910, sometime back then, when Rodin unveiled the thinker in London for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a guy named George Bernard Shaw, G.B. Shaw, who was kind of well known there. And he also would be photographed by this guy. And there's actually a photograph called G.B. Shaw. It was taken the night before, or like 2 nights before the premiere of The Thinker. And the title of the photograph is G.B. Shaw in the pose of the thinker. Right? But his hand is up on his forehead.
No way.
And they were there. I mean, they were there. So that's just really bizarre.
Way.
Which makes you think maybe there's something
like that. I remember.
Like that. But do you remember the fist, or do you remember like just a light touch under the?
A light touch.
That's what it is now. So you are in the majority in that case, right?
Yeah, I remember that. Do you remember it that way, or?
I remember it being more of a fist, but that's kind of a minority. I think. But I mean, I also don't feel that strongly about it because I like to say if there's significance and proximity to something, then you're more likely to get it right. And I never had proximity to a thinker statue. I might have seen it in a book once, and it wasn't until I went to Stanford and I saw the physical, there, which is like this now. But for me, that's interesting because there are physical artifacts.
Absolutely.
And like with the Isaiah thing, there are physical artifacts that show the lion and the lamb. And so that's
I've had interviewed people that have written books on the Mandela effect and have conferences on it. And they have.
Sue Larson has a conference.
Yeah, Sue's a great friend of mine. She's on. We're going to have her on again soon. She talks about an event she had where she walked in a room and a light switch was always in a certain spot, and then one day it wasn't. It was like on the other side of the room, and she's had a lot of things like that happen to her. Physical things that she knew definitively were right like a month ago, and then all of a sudden things change. So I don't know if these people are more closely tuned into it, that it's more like they become more aware of it. But it's interesting because a lot of people are talking about it, and it's become like part of the zeitgeist, of society. People are just talking about it a lot, and it drives me nuts. So we have a few minutes before we end. And I'm going to ask you to come back to do a part 2 because I have so many more questions that we didn't get to talk about based on your book specifically. I have pages of notes. When you get some free time, I'd love to have you back for that. But I'll email you and hopefully we can arrange that. And I wanted to talk to you about God a lot, but what's your perception personally on, you obviously are a learned person. You're highly educated. You're a brilliant mind. What's your position on God in this whole thing?
Well, I take the position that we have a creator of the simulation, and our physical world is the simulation. we also are co-creators of the simulation in that we have a say in what we're doing here. So in some ways, we're helping set up, some of the circumstances, etc. So I don't take a strong position as to what's outside of the simulation, other than there is a creator. And if you go towards the RPG version, then we are co-creators, if you will. Now, there may be another level beyond that, which leads eventually to one consciousness, which could be called God. But certainly we have enough evidence from people who've had near-death experiences. But I wonder if even what they see are still simulations. They describe a garden or a natural scene or a crystal city, and those could in fact also be sort of creations from a higher level of existence. So I believe everything eventually leads to God, but I don't take a strong position as to exactly what form that takes. Not so much that I don't take a position on is there God, but what does that mean is what I don't take a strong position on.
Has written you after you wrote this book, this second edition, did it change your original position on things, or did this just like reinforce this theory for you?
Well, for me, I came to the conclusion that we're in some kind of a video game on my own. And then as I started to write the book, it reinforced it because, as I looked more into the quantum physics and I looked more into the computer science and the computation, I realized, oh, wow, it's not just an idea that I had, it's actually backed up by, actual, at least scientific frameworks, right? We don't have any proof that it's simulation. And then when I looked into the religious scriptures, that really got me thinking that were they describing the simulation all along? So in fact, I'm writing another book called God and the Simulation that is it's doing a deep dive into religious texts and trying to show. In fact, I wrote an academic paper about this idea that scriptures are just metaphors for what the divine is trying to tell us, and that the simulation hypothesis is the best metaphor because it actually fits all of what these old scriptures are saying. They used older technology and they use older metaphors, and that if we were to update those metaphors, particularly for younger people today, maybe we wouldn't have so many atheists. We would have people who
yes, so true. Yeah. So true. What do you want people to take away after they read your book? What's your goal?
Well, so first, my goal is to try to bring together the worlds of science and spirituality. And, these have gotten further apart. Even though there are more scientists that are interested in spirituality than before, overall, the sentiment is like far apart. I mean, I've been on podcasts in LA where they were just like any mention of God and religion, and they were attacking you like that can't be, that's all nonsense, because they're still fighting the old battle. Right? The old battle was either science or religion, and therefore we have to reject anything about spirituality, anything esoteric, anything non-material. But that battle's over. I mean, science has proven itself, but they're still fighting the battle. What I want them to think about now is what elements of science and what elements of spirituality actually coincide, and can one be used to explain the other? Because in the end, in both cases, we are trying to get at the truth of the nature of the universe. Right? And so that's what I want people to do. Perfectly
said, Rizwan. I mean, I highly recommend folks read your book. You got a copy to show? Because I had the PDF version.
I do.
And we'll have the link. Beautiful cover, too. We'll have the link to that in all the social media that we share. And you can go to his website where it's probably sold everywhere, right? Like Amazon.
Yeah, they can get it anywhere. Barnes and Noble. I encourage people to go to their local bookstore. If they don't have it, they can get it. I mean, it's through Penguin Random House, so it's pretty much in distribution.
I'm gonna order the hard copy because I'm an underliner and I like to have my highlighter back from the school days, I love to do that. So I'm going to be ordering a hard copy today, actually, because fascinating. You're such a brilliant mind. And I thank you so much. Today was just a tip of the iceberg of this conversation. And like I said, when you have time, I really would appreciate if you could come back, maybe do a live with us so we could get some questions from folks that join the chat.
Yeah, that would be great. Let's plan to do that next time.
I will email you. Thank you, Rizwan. It was such a
Thank you.
blessing meeting you and speaking with you. I'll be in touch soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, that was truly a fascinating conversation. And I'm so looking forward to doing this again and soon, because I literally have like 4 pages of questions to ask. So thank you all for tuning in. And you've been listening to Ethereal Encounters Unveiled live on United Public, well, not live today. Today we were in a pre-recording, but on United Public Radio Network and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, which is 105.3 on the Gulf Coast and 107.7 FM in New Orleans. And for all you guys that are listening on the radio, please be sure and join us. You can go to United Public Radio website and replay all of the episodes, or on YouTube or any social media. So as we wrap up today's conversation, and again, sorry about my hoarse voice, but I'm so thrilled we got to have this discussion with Rizwan. He's obviously a brilliant mind, and the book is absolutely phenomenal. You guys have to check it out. So be sure to tune in soon. We have a live show tomorrow and a live show Friday. Thursday and Friday, we have live shows. So I look forward to seeing each and every one of you. God bless. Love you all dearly. Bye-bye.